Thank you for coming tonight. This is a book launch, and it was quite a nice turnout for a book launch. It's a launch for this book, which is well worth buying if you haven't already bought it. It is in some ways a mission statement for PsiAN. It's in some ways a history of what most of us consider real psychotherapy, and it contains a lot of important information about the social and political and economic context in which our current problems continuing to do therapies of depth, insight, and relationship are up against. It goes into issues in those therapies themselves, and it ends up pushing in future directions, in addition to the four people who are talking tonight. It's got articles by Farhad Dalal, Nancy Burke, Susan Lazar, Oksana Yakushko, Alan Sholem, Enrico Gnaulati, John Thor Cornelius, Santiago Del Bois, Todd Essig, Erica Schmidt, and the late Bill Myers. All pretty passionate articles, all quite readable, and I think you'll find them quite interesting. Let me explain our plan for you. We thought that is the people that asked to get involved in discussion of the book, would talk for 10 minutes apiece in the order of first Usha Tummala-Narra, then Kirk Schneider, then Linda Michaels, then me, about whatever they want to talk about with respect to the book or their contribution to the book or the state of therapies of depth, insight, and relationship. Then we're going to have a panel discussion, not packaged. It's just going to be spontaneous. And then the audience is going to join us for discussion. We have given ourselves 2 hours if we need it. Our guess is we'll wrap up around 8:30, but if we're in the middle of a passionate conversation, we at least can go until the outer limits of the time we've signed up for. Now, I was asking Jasmine, who is coordinating for Division 39, to let us know whether ending at 8:30 compromises the CE credits that are part of this. So if that's the case, we'll go the whole 2 hours, no matter what we're talking about. But if people are getting an hour and a half CE or an hour CE credit, we'll have the option of stopping at an hour and a half, which is the time frame we originally thought about for this program. All of this is an effort to deal with the fact that psychotherapists are not an organized group. We have very different disciplines, even though what we do as therapists is more alike than what I would do, for example, as compared with another psychologist. We don't have organizations in which we cohere as a group that can defend ourselves. And in contrast, the drug companies, the insurance companies, certain groups of academic researchers, all do have organizations, and most of them have a lot of money. Now, increasingly, since managed care, psychotherapists are not anything near wealthy. We can make a decent middle-class living. But one of the things we need is a body of representatives who fight for the interests of real psychotherapy. Since COVID, it's become common to say that we're in a mental health crisis now, and I don't think that's an exaggeration. The suicide rate among adolescents has gone up 40% in the last decade. Now, people are attributing this to COVID, and I'm sure some of it does have to do with COVID, but I found myself wondering if some of it has to do with the fact that psychotherapy is so hard to come by for most people. What most of us think of as a genuine therapeutic connection that involves devotion and a kind of capacity to stick with somebody through thick and thin and really get to know them, that's been threatened from many directions. And I wonder if that were available, whether we would be seeing so much despair. Naturally, despair is a result of poverty, injustice, and many of the other social conditions that psychotherapists can't, as a group, do too much about. But it used to be that people could make a connection with a human being, be able to count on that connection, slowly open up to that human being, talk about areas of shame that they might not be able to bring up for a year and a half or 3 years, and slowly expose themselves to a professional who was committed to their welfare. And now, as one of the contributors to the book commented, it's as if we're suffering from a kind of milieu that says, okay, if you've got a headache, you take aspirin. You don't worry about what's the cause of the headache. You just take the aspirin, that'll reduce the symptoms. We don't want to think about the causes. When you don't think about causes, when you don't think about meaning, when you don't think about honest attachment, you're going to miss a lot, and people are going to get eventually much more despairing. I've even wondered, and of course, I don't think this is researchable, but I've even wondered if we would have had fewer of these like shoot 'em ups that we're suffering from so much as a culture now, if some of the perpetrators had had real psychotherapy. Many of them had been in the mental health system. They've been in and out. They've been medicated and sent home. They lost any hope that somebody else would be really interested in them. They got angrier and angrier. I think you could make an argument that we wouldn't have had as much social destruction if we had preserved real psychotherapy for everyone, not just the people who can afford long-term therapy. I would have been happy with the title of this book, Preserving Psychotherapy for the Next Generation. But I admire the writers, the editors, for deciding they were going to take the position of advancing psychotherapy for the next generation in this era of, call BetterHelp and get somebody who's not well trained, who is going to talk to you for a few minutes, and you're going to call that psychotherapy. At any rate, that's my rant, and I'll open with that rant and then turn it over to Usha to talk about whatever she wants to talk about in this context.
Good evening, everybody. It's really great to be here with all of you. Thank you, Nancy, for framing our evening. I wanted to talk a bit about something outside the realm of clinical work for a moment, because in addition to being a clinician, much of my early career work actually centered on community outreach and educating different communities around mental health and psychotherapy. And so I felt that this was really in line with PsiAN's mission in particular. And more than ever, I feel, for many of the reasons you mentioned, Nancy, around the accessibility to psychotherapy, in-depth psychotherapy, and the misinformation about mental health, and the misinformation about what therapy is. It feels like a particularly compelling time for me to get back involved with community-based work, actually, and trying to think about psychodynamic and psychoanalytic principles and ideas, how to then translate them into community work. I actually now have a couple of students who graduated from the Danielson Institute at Boston University recently, who decided to put together TikTok posts and Instagram posts to combat misinformation around mental health. So things like what is narcissistic personality, and actually giving accurate information, combating all the stuff that so many young people in particular encounter in social media that is actually derailing them from understanding the complexity of psychological issues, as well as what therapy actually is. So it's been great to be able to get a younger generation engaged with this kind of community outreach work. I do want to just share with you an example of something that I shared in my chapter in this book. It's an example of a community-based intervention that presented some dilemmas, which I think as psychodynamically oriented people, we can think, it will raise some interesting questions, I hope, for discussion. So I want to just share with you an example from this particular chapter. This was when I was a coordinator for a community-based outreach project in a large city in the Northeast, and I was asked by an administrator in an urban middle school to help develop psychoeducational group meetings in an after-school program. And the staff and the majority of the students at the middle school are African American. The rest of the students are of Latinx or multiracial backgrounds. The staff at the after-school program had been increasingly concerned about the students' exposure to violence in their neighborhoods. And many of the staff members recognized the stress experienced by these students, particularly a few boys who verbally expressed their anger after witnessing two men mugging a young woman. My colleague, who's a white American woman, Euro-American woman, she and I had arranged a meeting with the staff at the after-school program. And at this initial meeting, the first meeting that we had, my colleague and I learned that these traumatic experiences were typically not talked about in their families or at school. And the staff was hoping to find ways to address students' exposure to violence at a weekly discussion group focused on health topics like physical health, emotional health, which the students were then required to attend. During this first meeting, an African-American staff member also expressed concern about the ability of doctors from a predominantly white institution, that would be me and my colleague, our ability to relate to the concerns of the school, the students, and the community. When I heard the staff member's response, I was moved by her honesty, and at the same time felt as though she hadn't noticed my race or ethnicity. It was as though she was solely responding to my white colleague, who was silent throughout most of the meeting. And I acknowledged to the staff that my institution was predominantly white and asked them to provide more detail about what they were concerned about. And a different staff member said, "We really want to make sure that you all understand the community here and what our kids go through and what's realistic for them." Other staff members agreed and joined in voicing their concerns about our approach to the after-school program. And it was really clear to me at this point that the staff were understandably protective of the students' welfare and cautious about any negative outside influence that would further stress the students out. The staff's concerns reflected previous experiences with healthcare professionals who had disappointed the school community. One example of this was raised by a staff person who said, "I'm worried about how many of our boys have the label of ADHD, and the parents are just told to give them medicine. Some of these boys just need to talk to someone. Not all of these drugs, but this is what the doctors tell them to do." As the staff continued to discuss their concerns, I was aware that many of the staff and students had previously experienced institutional racism, and I was also aware of the cultural mistrust towards me, possibly because of a concern that I may have internalized the oppressive culture of institutions from, that was the perception, and also towards my colleague who may have been experienced as representing institutions that were discriminatory. While driving back to our office after this meeting, I asked my colleague why she had remained so silent during this meeting. And she told me that she felt overwhelmed by a sense of sadness and guilt and worried that she would enact the situation that the staff had feared by taking over the meeting, by talking. She then chose to stay silent to cope with feeling simultaneously like an outsider and an oppressor. I told her that interestingly, I felt like an outsider since my race and ethnicity were treated as irrelevant or invisible, and that racial difference had been conceptualized around Black-white lines, as they typically are in mainstream American society. My colleague then said she felt surprised by my reaction, that she had seen me as an insider because of my Indian background. And indeed, the consultants had felt othered. At the same time, we wondered whether we had othered the staff in some way. We were also aware of being outside of the comfort zone of our offices and potentially imposing ourselves at school. It was clear that my colleagues' feelings of guilt and feelings of invisibility, which were connected with longstanding racial dynamics, and the ambivalent position of race and racial identity among Indians, contributed to this racial dynamic at this after-school program. So I continue on in the chapter, but I wanted to give you a sense of some dilemmas right from the very start that I think can be informed by dynamic thinking, and that we need to really find ways to apply what we know around relational dynamics, around transference, countertransference, enactments into not only our clinical work, but also beyond, and find ways to make real help, I would say, accessible to people who desperately need it. So with that, let me stop there.
So thank you very much, Usha, for that relevant framing. And thank you all for being here and organizing around this this very critical book. Let's see, I'm going to dig a little deeper than my chapter in this talk, because I wanted to bring the chapter out in terms of some of the more recent findings that I think are particularly relevant to our times right now. Certainly these things are implicit in the chapter, but I'm going to make them more explicit right now. So I believe strongly that we've got a groundlessness and helplessness problem in our profession and culture. And many of us simply aren't aware of it or don't want to address it. For to face and address our basic groundlessness and helplessness would place us directly in the situation so many of us design our lives around avoiding. The primal terror, or what Otto Rank calls the irrational difference, otherness, is really what I'm talking about, a sense of groundlessness and helplessness, which I think is endemic to our human condition around difference, otherness, and the radically unknown. And Rank traces this to what he calls the trauma of birth. I'd call the drama of birth, because I don't think it's only a template for anxiety, later anxiety and trauma, but also has elements of wonder and discovery. And a huge question here is, how is this primal groundlessness and helplessness met by our caretakers and by the culture that surrounds them? Moreover, I see this primal terror as at the root of the defensive reductionism that has taken over so much of our field as well as culture. This manifests as destructiveness, withdrawal, and superficiality in so many places. And I don't think we're very good at facing and working with this primal condition of ours outside of our depth therapeutic conditions. And especially in this quick fix, instant result world that we live in. We're great at bringing technical solutions to our patients and citizenry, efficiency. But as a rule, we're pretty bad at providing them with the tools or equipment to deal with their inner lives, their ability to work with the primal anxiety of being thrown into an unknown and chaotic world, a world of difference, the radically unknown again, both within themselves and in their relationships to others and the world. This lack of equipping is just not sustainable. And although the efficiency model for living has brought us many outward advancements, for example, in our standard of living, our conveniences, and our ability to mechanically reduce pain and disorder, it has been a disaster, I think, as many of us are now realizing, as a remedy to assuage the deeper, whole-bodied struggles to live fuller, richer lives, more meaningful lives, and more ethical lives. That I equate with what I call awe-based consciousness, or a sense of the humility and wonder, or sense of adventure toward living, that I think so many of us yearn for, but are kept from fully realizing to a large degree because of our efficiency-oriented mechanistic culture we live in. Now, I want to ask, I guess, a rather provocative question. Is such denial of our basic groundlessness and helplessness the subtler basis, along with the profit margin, by which the shorter-term programmatic therapies are so often seen as the be-all and end-all in our society? And let me be clear that I certainly see a value to many of these programmatic therapies and medicine as well. Within given contexts, the problem is more and more in many areas of our field, they're being seen as the be-all and end-all. And that is a major problem. Now, I believe that we can not only greatly benefit from Ronk's profound and underappreciated understanding of this problem, but also from the underappreciated wisdom, at least this part of his wisdom, of William James, the putative founder of our field. And I want to recite to you what James says about the problem with psychology moving more toward a mechanistic approach toward human experience. Back in 1892, he wrote, "When we talk of psychology as a natural science, we must not assume that means a sort of psychology that stands at last on solid ground. It means just the reverse. It means a psychology particularly fragile and into which the waters of metaphysical criticism leak at every joint. A psychology whose elementary assumptions and data must be reconsidered in wider connections and translated into other terms." Okay, well, enter Romanticism, or the neo-Romanticism of romantic psychology, which derived from the 18th and 19th century thinkers such as Goethe, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Emerson, and yes, James, who didn't so much reject the rationalism of natural science, but felt it needed to be enlarged and deepened in order to more accurately reflect the human experience, or the lived world, as the phenomenological pioneer Edmund Husserl put it. My chapter toward a science of the heart is really about a call to revive this earlier effort, this direction of depth, as Freud as well had clearly pursued and pioneered. And it emphasizes three basic themes, a number of which I believe go beyond Freud, but he was at the origin. One, the interrelated wholeness of experience. Two, access to such wholeness by means of tacit modalities, such as affect, intuition, and kinesthesia or embodiment. And three, qualitative descriptive accounts of such processes, such as the phenomenological approach. This approach means further that we need to enlarge upon the idea that understanding in psychology can be equated with measurement and overt behaviors. By contrast, understanding must encompass rich description, the arts and humanities even, which, as many of you know, Freud recommended in his paper on lay analysis. Even such an early skeptic of qualitative research as D.T. Campbell wrote, and I quote, more and more I have come to the conclusion that the core of the scientific method is not experimentation per se, but the strategy connoted by the phrase plausible and rival hypotheses. In other words, this is something more akin to William James's idea of radical empiricism, where lived experiences are counted as data along with the overt and measurable, and sorted out in the marketplace of rivaling and plausible findings. Finally, it is no secret to many of you here that key aspects of lived experience, affect, intuition, imagination, and kinesthesia are integral to, if not directly correlated, with the key elements of effective psychotherapy. The contextual relational factors of the therapeutic alliance, empathy, genuineness, mutuality, and affect, to name a few, are directly connected to this notion of being able to be more present to what we're calling lived experience, what Bronk called the non-rational. Isn't it high time that our field recognize what even mainstream researchers have been underscoring for years? That therapists and therapeutic elements of depth, insight, and relationship are key to fuller understanding as well as revitalization of suffering in human beings. And I want to make one quick point about our current field. Existential humanistic and psychoanalytic psychology come out of the same root system, in my view. The same seedbed of romantic and neo-romantic science and philosophy, the ghosts of Goethe, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and indeed, in their way, even Lao Tzu, Rumi, and Rilke. They all haunt us and give us our depth and broad scope. The attempt, as the great author of The Denial of Death, Ernest Becker, intimated on his deathbed, the attempt to grasp the human condition in all its starkness with as few consolations as possible should be the aim of any science of humanity worth its calling. And that is our calling, as I contend, toward a science of the heart, to consider the human condition before the mystery of existence, indeed the miracle of existence, as well as before the neurological, behavioral, and interpersonal contexts within which we dwell. Which is precisely why I believe our profession is off base, actually, when it insists on calling our field psychological science and those who practice it psychological scientists. We are not only scientists in that distant and calculative sense. We are scientists, artisans, or practitioners of a human science, not only a natural science. And if we keep on beating down that latter path, we risk not only shortchanging our patients, but profoundly misunderstanding the motives and consequences of collective upheavals, such as war, hate, and violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirk, and very powerful. And I just really appreciate how everyone is bringing in the broader context and relating this to the outside world. It's so important. Before I say a little bit about the chapter that I contributed to the book, I wanted to say a few words about PsiAN and why we started it and what we hope our contributions are to the field and the broader world, which relates to why we put the book out there and many of the arguments and issues that we're talking about tonight. And also just want to mention that of the many hats that these dear colleagues of mine wear, one is related to PsiAN. Nancy is an advisor to PsiAN. Kirk has been on our steering committee since day one, I think. And Usha is our vice chair. So it's very exciting to have all of them together in the book and here tonight. PsiAN was born out of what we're talking about, a really deep pride in depth therapy and the many ways in which it can help heal and even radically transform people's lives. And we were so troubled and sometimes terrified that depth therapy was being depreciated in so many ways, ranging from insurance companies to legislators to the general public, and even folks closer to home, such as academic researchers or professors teaching the next generation of therapists. So these issues were pressing and really felt life-threatening in some ways to depth therapy. And this was going on as broader societal and cultural values were also shifting, and political and economic forces, neoliberal forces were coming into prominence as well. And these had effects on the mental health landscape and even on therapies themselves. So there's a lot in the book about this. Nancy has a wonderful chapter on the problems with the mental health diagnostic system and differing conceptualizations of mental distress. There are chapters on the short-sightedness of evidence-based care and research. And there's just a lot there. I won't go into all of that, of course, but this is also all happening in a really fragmented regulatory system that doesn't hold insurance companies accountable for paying for care that people need. And again, all set against the neoliberal mindset that pervades so many aspects of our society, many times without us being fully aware of those effects. And then there are the contributions of psychoanalysis itself, preferring isolation to engagement with the academy and research worlds. And I think the narrower the focus got of psychoanalysis, the more infighting among psychoanalytic schools, and of course, the fewer opportunities to be both impacted by and contribute to the teaching and researching of therapy, where we really need to have a prominent place. And then a lot of confusion and misunderstanding by the general public, which is the chapter in the research that I worked on with my colleague, Santiago Del Bois. So this is a lot. And at first we thought, oh yeah, we can fix all of this. We can take this whole thing on. And we very quickly realized that some of these problems will take decades to turn around and lots of money and resources. So we, have those in mind as well, but we have refined our focus over the 7 years, even as we've stayed true to our vision that these therapies be accessible in all communities for all who want them. And it seems like this vision and our work really resonate with so many of you. We have over now 5,600 individual members and 90 organizational partners, including Division 39. And I think it's really helped that we've taken the approach that Nancy mentioned by welcoming people, whatever their discipline or degree or theoretical orientation, and trying to bring folks together to speak with a stronger, more powerful voice. I was presenting yesterday at a conference for social workers, and it was noted several times, and kind of people made a point to mention that I was a psychologist, and I just think that was not a very interesting detail. I hope that would fade into the background and we can talk about more important things. But there are these silos that artificially separate us. And I think we need to put a lot of that and a lot of the jargon behind us, which is why we did coin that phrase that Kirk just used, therapies of depth, insight, and relationship. Plain words, clear words, want it to be a relatable phrase. And it's really caught on, actually so much so that we just trademarked it with the federal government. But a few words now about the research that Santiago and I conducted with the general public. We really wanted to understand what the public thinks and feels and expects and worries about and hopes for when it comes to mental health and therapy. Oddly enough, both Santiago and I are career changers, and we've made the same change. We were both first in the business world, where we did a lot of research to understand consumers, of course, focused on purchasing behaviors. But to do that, you really have to do research into their motivations and their implicit reasons and reasoning for the preferences that they have. And it's getting more and more complex all the time. But, we knew how to do this kind of research, and we thought it could be a useful lens to study the challenges that our field is facing. And corporations do this, they're doing it all the time to better understand customers, but really also to build bridges and connect with these customers, to educate, to foster awareness. All of these are things that we're aiming for as well. So we did a lot of research. We did a qualitative arm with 46 in-depth interviews that ranged from about 30 to 90 minutes per person, people from all over the country. And then we did a quantitative online study for which we hired a professional firm to execute that, to make sure we could have a representative sample of the US population. We did get that sample, over 1,500 individuals representative of the US population by age, gender, race, geographic region, and income. And we did that quantitative survey in 2020, which is what we wrote about in the book chapter. We've also just returned to that research and done another study in August, and we're very close to having all of the analysis done on that data, and we'll be able to share that with everyone very soon. There is a lot of consistency between the 2020 and 2023, which is good news. And then, of course, we added a number of questions about technology and apps and things like that. But the headlines from both surveys is the headlines are really, really good news for depth therapy. It's amazing that what the people want from therapy aligns so well with what we have to offer in several important ways. When we asked them, what do you most want to get out of therapy? A majority said they want to get to the root. They want to get to the root of their issues and themselves. They want more self-awareness, more self-understanding. They want help changing patterns and relationships. And they believe that problems in relationships are a key reason that people go to therapy in the first place. They understand therapy takes time. They understand their problems have taken time to emerge in the ways that they have. They consider therapy to be a really valuable experience and really an investment that they can make in the process of therapy, and ultimately an investment they can make in themselves. And they really value the relational aspects of therapy, of sharing their thoughts and feelings with someone they can trust without being judged, etc. So this is the best I think we could have hoped for in terms of this match between what people want and what we have to offer. People even said, nearly 90% of people said, yeah, I would rather have therapy, even if it takes a lot longer, a therapy that gets to the root causes, and not just manages my symptoms. 90% said, yeah, that's what I would sign up for. So that's all the good news. The not so great news is they do have questions and confusion. You know, how do I find a therapist? Does my insurance work for me? And those are things that I think in 2023 are coming. People are a little bit more confident in answering those questions for themselves. There's just with stigma going down and more people needing help. Some of those problems are being solved, but the one problem that I think we all should be very concerned about is we did a portion of the research study focused on asking people to compare what they thought and felt about psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic therapy to what they thought and felt about CBT. And the reason we picked those two kinds of therapies was because really those were the only two that most people were aware of. All other forms of therapy people really had never heard of, including the term psychodynamic therapy. So we really focused in and drilled down on psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic therapy and CBT. And here's where the story is not so great for us, and I think we have a lot of work to do. People did, as far as their associations to psychoanalysis, say that, yes, that would be a kind of therapy that would more so get to root causes of problems. So that matches up with their interest in getting to the root. But, you know, it's really mostly for very serious problems. It's probably not for me. It's very expensive. It takes a really long time. It's very stressful. And I don't even really think people do that anymore. Regarding associations to CBT, it was a very different picture. People said, yes, CBT would provide long-lasting results. It's a very strong therapy. It's effective. It's relevant for today. It could help anyone, sort of regardless of their problems or demographics. And yeah, it sounds really good. So this is a very concerning difference that these associations that we really need to tackle with the public and try to change these, because the public also told us, and this is again not good news for us, that their associations to psychoanalytic therapists were that they were cold and unempathic and not good listeners. And this is incredibly important for us to be aware of and understand, because the public does appreciate those relational aspects of therapy and the therapeutic relationship. And so I do worry that for many people, we just don't even enter into their consideration set when they're thinking about finding a therapist, if they do have these associations top of mind. So we at PsiAN have some plans to try to educate the public and turn around some of these, but this is going to be a big job that would require all of us coming together. And we are going to continue to do more research and understand evolving trends and our role in the greater mental health system, how we're perceived, etc. And I think it's especially important when there are so many pressing concerns that we face as a field. Questions, how can we best use new technologies instead of the technologies using or replacing us? How can we stand up for the human, as Kirk was saying, for the art in what we do, while our cultural values are prizing control and efficiency and certainty and uniformity? And how can we work to enforce parity within that? We have stepped into and embraced that medical model, for better or for worse, but without capitulating to all of the demands of that model and the needs for, as Farhad Dalal writes about it in the book, the fetishization of measurement. And, questions about, will our work continue to move along one possible trajectory, which is what started out as a craft honed through apprenticeship is turning into, some apps would have it be more turned into kind of an assembly line, automated labor kind of a situation, which we certainly don't want to see happen. And how can we make our therapies accessible? And by that, I mean, not just financially, but looking at this body of research, also conceptually. How can people see us as truly someone who can help them achieve those benefits of getting to the root of themselves and understanding themselves better, so they can live more of the life they want to live, and really make depth therapy something that they would want to seek out for themselves. So those are some of the questions that we have moving forward. And with that, I will pause here and turn it over to Nancy. Thank you.
I was not surprised by the outcome of Linda's research on what people want. It reminds me of what happened with my grandson a couple of years ago. He was 8 years old and he'd had a series of catastrophes, lost 2 grandparents on his father's side, 2 of his pets died. There was a huge storm that knocked over his favorite tree. His school, which had opened after COVID, closed down again because of resurgence of COVID. And he was in a desperate state. And his mother said to him, buddy, you think maybe you'd want to talk to a psychotherapist? And Buddy said, what's a psychotherapist? She said, well, there are actually people whose job it is to help you with your feelings. In fact, we have 2 people in your family that have that job, Grandma and Michael. So a psychotherapist is somebody that you go and you talk to about things that are bothering you, and they help you with them. And Buddy's reaction was, sign me up. And he then went to play therapy and began bragging about things his play therapist said to all his friends. He sounded like an Upper West Side person talking about his analyst and how, what his analyst had said that week back in the 1960s. At any rate, we do have what people need and what people want. And the question is to get that information out despite all the forces counteracting it. And one of the things that I've been interested in for a long time, and I've been interested in there being an organization like PsiAN ever since it was a gleam in Nancy Burke's eye years ago. But we had one such organization, the National Coalition of Mental Health Providers and professionals, and that's important, by the way, and consumers, which kind of ran out of gas at a certain point, but it did accomplish the achievement of fighting off the American Psychological Association's press to have a division of managed care in APA. That was the only national group that I knew of that was pursuing the kinds of things that PsiAN is now pursuing. I've always been interested in words, and I think words matter tremendously. And so diagnosis matters because those are the words by which we try to describe human suffering. Speaking of words and speaking of the National Coalition, Karen Shore wrote a wonderful article very early about the implications of the term provider, which was being foisted on us by insurance companies as a replacement for professional, doctor, psychologist, psychiatrist, counselor, healer of the soul, and many other things that we had been called. But now we were a provider. We were a provider of a commodity, and we were getting all kinds of pressure to see ourselves as technicians rather than general healers who might use specific techniques, but the relationship was the important thing, and the technique was a matter of judgment after you establish somebody in a relationship. At any rate, my orienting interest has always been in individual differences. not just diagnostic differences, but all kinds of individual differences. I really thrive on getting a sense of somebody's individuality. I was very influenced by Henry Murray's approach to personology. And I began feeling when DSM shifted from DSM-2 to 3, that we were going to lose a lot of wisdom about personality, as well as many other things, in this effort to go to so-called neo-Kraepelinian diagnosis, meaning descriptive and categorical psychiatric diagnosis, instead of a diagnosis that is more inferential, meaning that you try to infer the meaning of a symptom, that is dimensional, meaning that everything is a matter of more or less. It's not whether you either have it or you don't. And contextual, meaning that things mean very different things in different contexts. If I might meet all the criteria for paranoid personality disorder, but be an undocumented immigrant who's being told by his boss, who's paying me less than the minimum wage, that I'll be reported to the authorities if I don't accept minimum wage for my work. I'm going to get all of the features of paranoia as a result. I'm going to be suspicious and distrusting, and I don't have paranoid personality disorder. You can't assume that without knowing the context of the person. So I've always been interested in a diagnostic project that is inferential, dimensional, and contextual. And we have lost that to the defensive reductionism that Kirk was talking about. The term diagnosis is from the Greek, and it means to know, gnosis, gnosis, to know through, to know thoroughly, to know deeply, right? So that doesn't mean that you just tote up symptoms. And about personality, it has always seemed to me that personality is not a matter of just measuring traits, because you see opposite traits in people. In schizoid people, you see the trait of withdrawal coexisting with yearnings for closeness. In obsessional people, you see the trait of fanatical neatness coexisting with having a big mess somewhere. With hysterical people, you see a combination of hypersexuality, seeming hypersexuality anyway, and sexual inhibition. In paranoid personality, you see distrust, but you also see sometimes overtrust, like the sense that one's cult leader is flawless. So what really differentiates one type of personality from another is not the traits at either end of the spectrum, but the spectrum itself. What is the theme of the person? What is the story of the person? What is the dimension along which they're organized? You know, an obsessive person's organized around a dimension of control versus discontrol, and the schizoid person around closeness versus distance. Those are just different axes that are salient to them. And there's something about quantifying traits that makes it not only unlikely to see those things, but gets in the way of seeing them. I firmly believe that people have a drive toward truth. Jim Grotstein used to talk about a truth drive, which he took from Klein's notion of the epistemophilic drive. People want to understand. That was something that Linda's research showed. People want to understand. It's what Kirk talked about in the search for truth. It was what the people who were talking to Usha were trying to be true to who they were. They needed to be true, even though it wasn't socially quite easy to do so. So I think that psychoanalytic and humanistic psychologies, and for that matter, CBT practitioners who practice in the real world with real patients for the long term, appreciate that we need to think more complexly, and we need to preserve our rather strange art from the forces that are arrayed against it. The positive psychologists would, following Jeremy Bentham, as Dalal has shown in his chapter, would talk about, seeking happiness. But I think most of us in real psychotherapy talk about the importance of bearing witness to unhappiness, of tolerating unhappiness, of being honest about suffering. And that we don't think that mental health is simply finding more and more ways to ignore suffering, but to find a way through it instead of just being rewarded for denying it. So that's essentially what my own contribution is about in this volume. I think several people on this call have heard me talk about this many times, but I think at this point we should be opening it up to the panel discussion, and we'll go from there.
Well, I don't know who's going to begin, but I'll jump in. Thank you very much, Nancy, for giving an eloquent overview of our concerns. Yeah, I think it's really vital that we marshal our forces in our profession to help people come to terms with the unknown. We're really high on prediction and control, but we're not so good at supporting people to learn to be with uncomfortable feelings, uncomfortable ideas, uncomfortable conversations. And so I think that is a lot of what our depth therapies funnel into, is giving people a space to work with, to practice not only being okay with their vulnerability, especially again that primal terror that most of us seem to have of of being in some kind of chaos, some kind of just uncertainty. That we need to help people almost literally and figuratively reoccupy the parts of themselves that they block off around that sense of groundlessness and helplessness. And that will help. I feel it's helped me to experience greater inner freedom and a more whole-bodied experience of living. That's just some thoughts that I'm riffing off of here.
Kirk, one of the things that what you're sharing about this helplessness and despair experience that so many people have at this moment. I was recently at an event at Boston University, where I am, with a group of undergraduate students who were basically there to have a discussion about caring for the community. That's their theme. And one of the things that came up in this conversation was the question that actually one particular student had, which I thought was the best question of the evening. And he asked, well, you all sit with a lot of despair, and, are you ever happy? Because when I come out of my classroom, I'm depressed because my professors talk about things in ways that I don't feel hope. And I thought that was a really profound thing. And I hear this over and over again with so many younger folks and students who are sort of it's almost like they're asked to share things about themselves and talk about things that are so deeply traumatic and despairing, but are not really given the opportunity to do something with that. That's, so there's this kind, it's as if we're asking people to talk about their traumas and then walk out the room, with nothing that feels relationally holding about that experience. And so this is something that I think that so many people are experiencing at this moment. And, so your comments about that really brought that to the foreground for me, and why so many people could benefit from more in-depth work in whatever capacity that has to be, whether we're talking about psychotherapy or relational work in groups or communities.
Yeah, I've been very struck by that too, Usha. The sense of despair. It's partly I compare it to the feeling in the 60s, where there were certainly the same concern with social justice that we see now, but we thought the world would go on. We also felt we might have some power to do something. And I think contemporary young people in this era of internet shaming, globalization, mass culture, celebrity culture, and mobility, they have no reason to feel like they matter, that they could have an impact. They care passionately about things. They especially care about the few areas where they do have some control. What you do with your body, what you call yourself, what you do with your sexuality, how you talk about things. But I don't think they have a sense of any kind of larger power. And of course, they have the illusion that those of us who are older have a lot more power. I think we have more power than they do, but we are also, dancing to the same tune of this kind of world. And they are really hungry for us to stand for something they can get behind. But they're really expecting apocalypse. The patient of one of my supervisees recently said, I have no reason to save money. It wasn't because she had anything against, investing in the stock market or any political objections to that. It was, the world's going to hell. Why should I expect a future?
Yeah, there was just a cover story of Time magazine on compassion fatigue. And I think speaking to what all three of you are talking about, just the helplessness and hopelessness, particularly now that people are feeling, given everything that's going on in the world, which is so complicated and horrific. I think they did include, some things in that article which were helpful, and they did mention therapy as a place to deal with that, which I was pleased to see, and also, taking action, doing something, something small, but connecting with other people to kind of take some action, which I think is also good to point out, even though it kind of seems counterintuitive. If you're so depleted, where's the energy to do that? But I think it is something that right now in this current moment and generationally, it's a big issue.
Yeah, I think we really need a massive movement of providing emotionally restorative relationships for people. I mean, to have many more of these sacred spaces that we co-create or do our best to, at affordable and accessible rates. It's got to be a priority, it seems to me, because it's very hard to have that kind of holding environment, right? In the schools, like you were saying, Usha. I think you can create some of those structures. I mean, I've been very interested in promoting these supportive structured dialogues between people of very contrasting cultural and political backgrounds. And I think that's one way of helping people develop the tools to work with their anxieties. I do bring some depth psychological principles to that process. It's a way of helping people move from a reactive mode where they're just seeing each other as stereotypes and labels to a more humanizing mode where they're seeing a fuller human being before them and also within themselves. So I think this is a lot of what is needed is for places where people can come into the more of who they are. And I call that life-enhancing anxiety too. Not just the anxiety of terror and overwhelm, but anxiety that comes from the more equipped place to live on the edge of wonder and discovery, both within ourselves and between each other.
Related to that, I've been very interested in, speaking about words again, how people use the term depression for every time they feel sad. There's been a big confusion between clinical depression, which is a helpless state of mind, and normal sadness. And part of the reason is we don't have communal rituals to process normal grief. Small religious cultures have them, but as a large culture, we don't now. And that's a sacred space we really need to cultivate, because grief opens the door to acceptance, forgiveness, and as somebody said as Stephen Wrightboard said in the chat, joy.
Yeah, a fuller life, too.
Yeah.
More vital life.
Yeah, that quote you added, Stephen, is wonderful. Yeah, if others in the audience have comments or questions, please.
Yeah.
We'd love to hear from you. John, I think you're saying you.
Yes. Yeah, I did have some thoughts about, what to call what we do. I got so fed up with hundreds of brands of therapy that I declared myself a practitioner of plain old therapy. It really, it's much as Nancy described, to your grandson, I think it was, that's kind of what I would say I do. I talk to people about problems in their lives, which largely have to do with troubles in relationships. If you include your relationship with yourself, that covers the territory. Now, it was plain old therapy will never sell to anybody. But I found in talking to lots of different audiences and students that people resonated with that idea, that there's something right about it, simple talking about life and trouble in it. That's what we do. Now, the thing is, I actually know quite a bit. So it does help to have a lot of knowledge. But the other thing is, I think it is sad, that you mentioned psychoanalysis and people, that's something they did a long time ago. It's kind of, nobody does that anymore. But I wonder if people think when they do know something about therapy, they don't say, yeah, plain old therapy. They say, oh, CBT. Yeah, that's what therapy is. And I wonder what, quote, CBT therapists are actually doing. My guess is they're probably doing some version of plain old therapy, and they're not actually doing manualized therapy, even if they have to declare some brand to an insurance company. But I worked at the Menninger Clinic for 40 years, which was a long-term hospital. institution. It's changed dramatically now, but we brought in some people who were doing CBT. And it was really interesting because after they were working with patients, I mean, we were seeing patients with severe, complex trauma, comorbidity, and so forth. And they actually, over time, were doing much more relationally oriented work just by, there wasn't any choice. One of my CBT was a card-carrying CBT guy, senior, and he, after some years at Menninger, he said he had a postdoc who came in, and she was a CBT maven. She knew all these different techniques and stuff. And so, but her trouble was she came to him and she said, well, I don't know which one of these things to use. And he said, well, how about you start by getting to know the patient? And, I mean, so I don't know what actually people are doing out there. But I do know, if you read psychiatric journals, they say, yes, there's also this psychosocial stuff, i.e. CBT, like they don't know that there's anything besides CBT out there. So I don't know what my point is, except I think psychoanalysis, as you're discovering, is a kind of non-starter for a lot of people who are completely ignorant that psychoanalysis now is like 180 from the stereotype of the cold, disengaged interpreter. So I don't know what to do about it, but
Furthermore, CBT is reinventing psychoanalysis because you can't, work with people in any kind of depth without eventually learning what the rest of us have different words for. Let me read you an email I got a few years ago from a very experienced CBT colleague. It was at a point where the insurance companies were about to make some other, decision that would impact all of us. It says, if Bob is right, this would be a shame. I'm currently treating a patient who suffered with major depression, was socially isolated, never had a girlfriend, and was stuck in a dead-end job. In the past 6 months, he has made enormous progress. He's gotten off addictive drugs, developed several good friendships, received a big promotion at work, and has become engaged to a very nice woman. In addition, he has stopped missing and coming late to sessions. Not bad to accomplish all that in a 6-month period. The only thing is that this 6-month period occurred in his 7th year of treatment.
Yeah, right.
Okay? And he says, short-term
I love
CBT,
that.
question
Yeah.
mark.
Right.
So, I mean, if you're practicing with real people, you have to rediscover these things. It just makes me a little bit crazy that we already have knowledge that
Right.
they're not using.
Right, right. And I think, John, as you're saying, and Nancy, there is a conflation in the mind of the public. That did come out in our research. People said, oh yeah, talk therapy, that's CBT, and vice versa. So they look at it as one and the same. And psychoanalytic therapy is, who knows where, off the map entirely. And just to share a quick anecdote myself, a psychoanalyst who's in my office suite retired and referred some of her patients to me. And the one patient came in and they said, well, I want to keep doing that CBT that I've been doing with Dr. So-and-so. Who is a psychoanalyst? They thought they were doing CBT with a psychoanalyst. Yeah. So I think that's why a lot of the terminology and the brands and of therapy and the jargon and all of that is just gets in the way. But a real opportunity to educate the public on, what they should be looking for. What is real therapy? What is plain old therapy? What's quality therapy? What does it look like? What does it feel like? How can they find it? That's, one of the big goals that we have at PsiAN, to try to close some of these gaps and educate the public on some of these things, so they're not walking around thinking they're doing CBT with psychoanalysts.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm very interested in the research, because one of the prejudices that I've experienced in my practice is that people assume that CBT is solution focused. And if you go to any other therapist or an analyst, they're just going to keep asking you questions ad nauseum, and that you're going to walk away very frustrated eventually after maybe a year or a couple of years of work, that they will not provide you a solution. And I don't know if your research hinted at that, or is that a concern? Because I hear that very often, that, oh yeah, people just talk and then you just listen and nod. And whereas with CBT, there's homework, there's more application, it's more hands-on, and that I will walk away with a solution. And I think in this problem solution focused work, I really liked, I think Nancy said that about the dimensionality, the complexity. I think the appetite for that kind of abstraction is dwindling. So I don't know if the research, if your work is going to address that bias or prejudice that still exists.
Yeah, thank you. It's such a great comment. We did get at some of that in the research. People told us, so I'm just going to, a few different things I'll share that I think pertain to your point. People did say they were not all that interested in homework, and they really did not want, some of the typical or stereotypical CBT kinds of things. Like they didn't really want the therapist to set the agenda or start the session, things like that we associate with CBT. However, they did want guidance. They said, I'm going to this person who's an expert. I would hope that they would help me. And sometimes that form of help could be advice. And so they were looking for that, which I think is not unreasonable. That makes sense. And I think we have to understand that. They also said they want to work with someone. So I think it is a little bit of a more nuanced picture with the public, actually, which I think is again very good news for us. But when we think about what messages, how do people learn about therapy? How we learn about a lot of things, for better or for worse, these days, through advertising, through apps that have poured a lot of money into this, through insurance companies pumping out their information. And so people's their forms of educating themselves is limited. And I do think we need to start as a field speaking directly to the public, because they are hungry for this stuff. They will be receptive. They just don't know.
I think that's also opened up this whole space and created so much traction for coaches. Now you have the career coach and the life coach and the mind coach. And there seems to be a lot of overlap there as well. But so thank you so much for your...
There's even a thing now called self-therapy. Like you don't even need the therapist. Like you just do self-therapy on your own.
Yeah, the only problem is the counter-transference, as they used to say. Linda, there's a question for you in the
Oh, okay.
chat.
Oh, yes, thank you. So the ethnic and racial backgrounds of the people we researched and their ages. So the sample, it's a great question. The sample of all respondents is representative of the US population on those dimensions. So whatever the percentage of different ethnicities or ages are, the distribution of that in the US population, that's why we hired a professional firm, because we wanted our research sample to mirror that. So I don't remember what all the exact numbers were for percentages, but That's what we wanted, and we did use some weighting of the sample to ensure that our sample was representative in terms of age, in terms of gender, race, geographic region. We broke the country up into 4 or 5 different geographic regions, and income. And I will just say quickly, at a high level, we saw a lot of consistency in the results among across these demographic differences. Of course, there were some areas where there were clear differences, but as a general picture, we saw a lot of people want the same thing. You know, they want to understand themselves, as Nancy, you know, that drive for truth, and they want to take care of and invest in themselves. So a lot of the messages that I mentioned got a lot of resonance with all different demographic groups.
I know there's a question from Ellen Nasper.
I didn't realize I could unmute myself. I'm sorry. So I want to speak a little bit about a slightly different orientation to these issues, which I think are super important. I worked in community mental health for 26 years, having come out of a very psychoanalytic postdoc, and discovered during my postdoc that I hated the way we treated people with severe mental illness, especially people who were diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. So I got interested in other alternatives and actually got very involved in doing dialectical behavior therapy. And it was a project that lasted for a long time. It was extremely useful. So I think one of the things that I thought was so useful was that it was compassionate to teach people skills that people coming from healthy families learn as the course of development, but that people who have never been taught those skills don't learn. And that psychoanalytic approaches, at least at that time, kind of expected people to come upon that somehow hit or miss on their own. I think it's really helpful to think about what is the intervention for, who is it targeting, for what purpose, and does it work? Because the thing that strikes me about CBT approaches is that they don't work when people have conflict about using the skills they're going to be taught. Because CBT doesn't know how to address unconscious conflict. And that's where a more psychodynamic approach becomes extremely helpful and important. But if we can think about these as different tools and different ways of entering the conversation with a person and providing for different kinds of needs that people have, it's not that I'm at all against depth therapy. I think it's extremely important. But I also think it can be humane to do some of the things that CBT actually offers that psychoanalysis doesn't. And so I guess I want to be a little more dialectical in my point of view. Thanks.
I agree with that. I see myself as an existential integrative therapist. The question is the client's desire and capacity for change. Not everybody has the desire or the capacity to bear these very painful affects, right? Or at given moments of time and given phases of the work.
But sometimes when we teach them skills, they're less fearful of trying to make those changes because it's compassionate to say, you didn't know how, I'm going to help you know how. And that way you have something to work with. So I always object if we imply that there are people for whom our techniques don't work, then we need to rethink what we're doing. We need to be able to address the needs of the people that we're sitting with and not have expectations of them that if they don't meet some criteria, then we're not going to work with them, because that's a very limited theory then.
I agree. And I also think part of the issue is what is the therapist available for? Because sometimes clients don't even know where they want to go until they meet a certain person who's maybe more like a fellow traveler, if you will, to use Irv Yalom's analogy, as distinct from the doctor with the white coat who's going to give you the formula. There's all kinds of levels that I think we need to be attuned to.
There's another angle to this too. I really appreciate your point, Ellen, because I noticed with many of my doctoral students and master's students, they will come in with the idea that you don't do any problem solving in psychodynamic or psychoanalytic therapy, which is also not true. Like there are ways in which we are engaged in that in a different type of way. And so there's certain kinds of myths, I think, that are attached to all kinds of different therapies, but certainly with psychoanalytic or psychodynamic therapies, the idea that, well, we're not going to help people, really. It's really going to be just about, gaining insight, whatever that means. And it sounds really vague to people. And so oftentimes students will come in and say, well, I need tools. I don't, and what is this perspective going to do for me? And particularly the more anxious they are in getting started in the work, the idea that you actually are doing some type of problem solving, not quite like DBT, more specific strategies. The idea that you are still solving something or moving towards solving something in psychodynamic therapy it's not the public image. Going back to that issue of how do we actually talk about ourselves and what we do.
So have we reached a stopping point? I mean, we seem to have been opening more doors than we're closing, but that's pretty typical for those of us in this profession. Is there anyone out there who wants to register an opinion or ask a question?
Ellen, may I say something? Sorry. I don't know how to get the hand up, so my apologies if I just. I thought Ellen's point was really interesting, and before I did my psychoanalytic training, I just did the psychodynamic part of it. I was going back and forth a lot, sometimes pulling out a thought record, having trained in CBT and then DBT, and then sitting with the supervisor in psychoanalysis, and then reverting back and forth. So I hear that conflict, but eventually, I mean, we're talking about tools, and I think I agree with Usha that it's really a misconception. I mean, even giving an insight, isn't that a tool? Or even sometimes repeating a word or an expression back to them. That's a technique, that's a tool, and then they work with it. So eventually I did let those manualized ways of working go, because I thought that just working with the unconscious was so enriching and so powerful. It is a process. And I don't know why we feel that we are not providing tools or solutions or techniques, or are not adaptable or flexible. I think we are all of these things. It's just that we are not sort of using a label that CBT has marketed so well, or DBT or other types of therapies. So maybe something that all of you would address in your work going forward.
I would say that cultivating presence is a tool. That's a very intensive practice, to be able to stay with very uncomfortable feelings or thoughts. And one of the differences is that it's not necessarily a rational process or a mechanistic process. It's a process that opens one to the whole realm of the subconscious, the unknown. And so that's why I see it as more of maybe an artistic skill, certainly partly an artistic skill that we're offering. And I think it's perhaps one of the most important skills that we can learn, one of the most important gifts that could be bestowed on us, is to be able to reoccupy our body, our whole body experience and develop an inner home, as some have put it, that we can always return to.
I just noticed a hand up from Michael Koski.
Hi, everybody. I thought since we're getting close to ending, I wanted to end on a very positive note, which is a quick shout out to Nancy for your extraordinary book on psychoanalytic supervision. What a wonderful gift to the field. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
I graduated with a PhD in counseling psychology about 20 years ago, and the orientation there was very psychodynamic as far as work we were being taught. And shortly after graduating, I was invited by the school psychology program to come in and teach a course on group work with children and adolescents. Nobody in that department had any background in groups, and groups was one of my specialties. I love group work. So they asked if I can develop a course for their students who are now working at schools and they had to lead groups. And their program, the school psychology program, is very, very, very CBT. The faculty, you mention anything about relational psychoanalytic work, you get a real nasty look from the faculty. And they impart that to the students. They even have students can major in school psychology in a very behavioral way of working with kids. So when I began teaching my class and I introduced myself in the syllabus, I always just say to them, I'm coming as a guest. I'm the outsider, the alien, who's coming in with psychodynamic ideas. And I'm going to infuse it in the work we'll be doing to invite you to have a different lens to think about your students and their families. And much to my surprise and pleasure, over the years, whenever they do the evaluation, they always say how refreshing it was to hear this lens of relational psychodynamic work to expand their work with the kids and the families. And that's a very positive thing from a department that is so different from the work we do. I just wanted to throw that out to all of you.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you're saying. You know, I think we haven't really addressed it that explicitly, but we're operating under a whole socioeconomic model that emphasizes, you know, the speed, instant results, and appearance and packaging of things. And us in academia and psychology are not immune from that model, and in many ways forced to work within it too. So it's so good for you for providing an alternative space.
Definitely. And I think Alan wanted to make another comment.
Yeah, I really appreciate what Ellen said. I agree with it completely, that there are lots of ways to help people, and patients want tools. I did a ton of patient education, but I think the best tool that we have for emotion regulation is a good relationship. And I think this was so important to talk with patients about, that the best resource is a good, trusting, close relationship for it's basic attachment theory. And I would say, you know, it's really good to depend emotionally on other people. That's really a great thing to be able to do, but it is extremely difficult for patients with a trauma history. So I think that that's the tool, but obviously, if there are practical ways of helping people, I think, and we know them, either we refer to people who can do them or we do what we can. Linda, what I took from your study was a combination of people wanting understanding, but also practical help. And that's something that and I was not great at providing practical help. I was happy to give advice, but I rarely had it, because I didn't have to take the consequences of whatever the advice was. But anyway, I do think Ellen's perspective is vital.
There was also a comment in the chat don't know if you also about acknowledging the research that shows that 90% of psychotherapists are integrative.
Yeah.
Yeah, and as John was saying, the relationship, I mean, that comes up over and over again, that's, you know, the relationship is how the work is done, and it's the most important part of the work, and it's where the change comes from, et cetera. And that is certainly a common factor to many forms of therapy. And yeah, I think educating the public on that they should be looking for someone they feel they can trust and have an open, honest, trusting relationship with. That would be great. You know, instead of chasing, oh, I need a therapist who, you know, does, you know, anxiety, or I need a therapist for this diagnosis or that. That would be a great, I think, addition that we can help teach people. You should really be looking for someone that you feel like you can really talk to and open up to.
Yeah. And I think Stephen Reedboard made an excellent comment earlier about how, as people advance in the field of psychotherapists, as psychotherapists become more expert at their craft, they tend to be more relational. You know, this is what shines through above and beyond a lot of the techniques. And that's what the research shows too. So that is something we could highlight at PsiAN. I'm sure there's been studies on that.
I also just want to say that I agree with the comment from Shweta, you know, in the chat around the moving towards commonalities. And I feel like there's a way in which we need to hold that, the integrative piece, and also acknowledge that there are groups of people being told that, you know, if you belong to this cultural group or this sociocultural group or this racial group, that only this type of therapy will work for you, you know, and that those messages are prevalent even now. That, you know, CBT or, you know, problem solving approaches, whatever the marketing is around that, are appropriate for racial and ethnic minorities. And, you know, that is a social justice problem, where we think, you know, where certain types of therapies are made accessible for certain groups or thought to be more accepted or acceptable for certain groups. So I think we have to consider that alongside of the real understanding, the evidence that we have of these commonalities as well, and be able to put that out to the public, really educate the public about that, rather than, you know, sort of silo people based on certain categories and what types of therapies might work for them based on those categories.
Absolutely.
All right. I don't see any other hands going up. Anyone on the panel want to have a final comment?
Well, I'll just say we talked a lot tonight about, yeah, I think we have our work cut out for us in reaching the public. And I think if, you know, we can all have in mind a consistent message, you know, I do think we can be successful in reaching the public, and they're hungry for what we have to offer, and they're hungry for information about how to get help. And I think we really need to respond to that. And that is certainly one of the big projects we have at PsiAN. We're working on that. So I appreciate all of the discussion we had about our connection to the outside world. It's vital.
I would just add that I appreciate that we're all depth-oriented therapists. And I think more than perhaps ever, we now need to speak with each other and bring that depth dimension to the public. And there's a power in numbers in that way as well. So I really appreciate the big tent thinking about depth orientation, whether that's existential, humanistic, you know, psychodynamic, psychoanalytically oriented psychotherapy, or classical psychoanalysis, and other approaches concerned with the subconscious and the embodiment of our struggles, as well as as well as the language.